Again, I believe I first should try to um, say a few things about uh, how I look at learning from the philosophical perspective. Then only it will make sense. First, let's remind ourselves that yes, learning is central to education. Because by nature, education is a kind of activity which is connected with developing understanding and capabilities of the educatee. Uh, Now, we talked about this moral uh, kind of restriction on methods you can use. Therefore, any method which does not involve voluntary participation of the learner would be, or the educatee at this moment we can say, uh, would cannot be justified as a moral method. So for example, if tomorrow you find some uh, high-tech kind of ways of producing learning in people's mind by hooking them to some electrodes and passing certain kinds of their currents in their mind, and then they become mathematicians or scientists, then they will become mathematicians and scientists maybe, but they are not educated. So at this moment, this is not the process of education. Therefore, the only alternative left for education is to achieve its aims is learning. Therefore, learning is central to education. Uh, but then there arises a problem. Uh, the way sometimes we talk in the child-centered discourse about learning, then learning often seems to be a sort of aim in itself, and many people conflate it with education, that all learning is education. Uh, Now that is a very big problem, because there are certain kinds of things which could be learned but may not be very educative, because education also has this desirability criteria, that what is worth learning. So there is a possibility of learning something worthless which may not be considered educative. Therefore, all learning is not education. Uh, Another problem arises when learning is taught in such a manner that it does not have any standards. So which means that I am a child and I have to do something, and every activity is intrinsically guided by my own curiosity and interest, and my activities and my involvement produces learning. I think these kinds of statements are too vague. The psychological definition of learning has to be tweaked to be used in education. If I take a very simple case, let me take two cases. One, if I take squarely behavioristic definition of learning, a change of behavior produced by experience. And then if I get into the cognitivist side and I say, okay, a change in either behavior or state of mind or state of knowledge produced by the learner's experience, then that change is learning. Now, that might work as a psychological definition of learning, but educationally, we need to add something more to it, because education has this desirability criteria. As soon as you bring that criteria, then this becomes imperative for us to also put in standards. So if I take a very simple example, suppose you say that I have learned to mop the floor. Now, when would you say that I have learned? If I am mopping the floor in such a manner that there are patches remaining on it and I left several parts of it untended to, and there is dirt in the corners, etc., then you would say, I am learning, I have not learnt, which means learning requires mastery, however you define it. So when you attach mastery to the psychological learning, this becomes educationally useful. Uh, Now, mostly in child-centered discourse, this mastery side is left undefined, and anything which happens is considered learning. Now, if we look at education from this perspective, then the teacher's role is actually to situate that learning, one, in the curriculum. And curriculum is, to my mind, directed by aims. When I say curriculum is directed by aims, I don't mean that curriculum is not influenced by other socio-political, historical, economic considerations, etc. But the aims themselves are informed by these considerations. Therefore, this is not a statement to say that that aims are the only guide, but I am saying that aims are the most influential guide, because definition of curriculum itself is a scheme to achieve the aims from that perspective. So one has to situate one's learning that those standards of the curriculum, they have to come into perspective. Now the second thing, very important, is that when I am directly teaching in the classroom and my role as a teacher, is that there might be some general ways of human learning, psychologically speaking. Therefore, the interest of the child might be an important aspect in that. Fearlessness, possibility of exploration, asking questions, experiences of different nature, discussion with other children, other learners. All these things might be very important in learning. Therefore, I have to organize that. What I am saying in general here is that one has to take into consideration the theories of learning, various theories of learning, and has to find one's way among them, because there are lots of contradictions in various theories of learning. And then there is a very strong socio-cultural aspect. There might be several practices or several beliefs which the child comes to the school with, which might stand in the way of the kind of learning we want to take the child on. But those beliefs might be very important to the child to make meaning at this moment of his own life or her own life, and very deeply embedded emotionally. Therefore, unless until I know the culture and the community perspective on life and belief systems, I cannot start interacting with the child. Therefore, I have to moderate my interaction with the child in such a manner that gradually the child learns to question or examine his or her own beliefs. And that I cannot do unless until I take into consideration the full scope of the socio-cultural situation or context of the child. So now what I am saying is that the teacher's role then, mediated by philosophical considerations, pure knowledge considerations, psychological considerations of how children learn, and socio-cultural considerations. Within that, a teacher finds his way. I do not know whether your question was more sort of towards the concrete examples, because I have been actually talking in very abstract terms which form the framework, but leave open what kind of concrete examples could be constructed